Have I made any connection between business and peace for you yet? Okay, there's more. There's a lot more, actually. So let's, I promise you this. If you are in business, you are already doing way more for peace than you realize. And if you want to be an entrepreneur, what you are actually honestly saying is, you want to create more peace in the world. And if you're at a conference about conscious technology, you need to realize the moment you choose to be an entrepreneur, most entrepreneurs never realize this. They don't know they're in the peace business. But if you want to do conscious technology, you need to realize by serving people, by taking care of people, I am strengthening the fabric of society. I am taking care of people who are fundamentally, by definition, different from me. Because a customer, by definition, is somebody who doesn't have something that you do have, and who has something that you don't have. Let me stop there for just a moment and ask a quick question. How many of you understand how value gets created? How many people think value gets created by innovation? I'm so glad you put your hand down. Okay, so you had your hand up, and when you put your hand down, you proved to me that you do understand how value gets created. Innovation is a cost. Innovation does not create value. The magic, when you have a new idea and a new idea for a new product, and you start to think, I think my new product could be a valuable thing in the world, at that moment you decided not to work at some other job, not to spend your time doing something else that society already knows would benefit it, and instead to work on your new idea. At that point, all of society is investing in you, and you're investing in your future self, but it's a cost. It's a cost to society because you could have been doing something else. It's not until the moment that you exchange your new innovation with somebody else that value begins to be created. All new value is created by exchange. And when you do exchange, who's the customer? That's what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks whoever has the money is the customer. So here's lesson 2. There are always 2 customers. If you want to think about treating your customer better, which is the first lesson they teach you in business school maybe, remember that it's only half the lesson. In every transaction, there are 2 customers. And you have to treat both customers well if you want to do conscious, high-value business. Because you're a customer too when you're selling something to somebody. And you need to remember that relationship needs to stay equal and balanced. They are buying your product, you are buying their money. Because you need liquidity, you need capital, and they need your product or your service. There are 2 customers, and it is in every transaction 2 customers, and it's only when 2 customers take care of each other that you get fair trade, balanced trade, sustainable trade. And it's at that moment when you each give each other something you both have more of than you need. To get something you need much more. That's where new value happens. It's magic almost, because if you think about Brian has potatoes and I have butter. Let's go to a barter example just to make this very clear, okay? I have too many cows, I have more butter than I need, and I don't have any potatoes, and I really want potatoes with my butter. Brian has too many potatoes and no butter, and he really wants butter with his potatoes, okay? If I give him some of my surplus, and he gives me some of his surplus, we moved the surplus to where it was needed more. By moving it to where it was needed more, that's what creates new value. So when you are choosing to be an entrepreneur, you are choosing to be a creator of capital. And the creation and curation of capital is a sacred act. It's a sacred act not because I say it's sacred, but it's a sacred act because that is the most effective way our species, and not only our species, that is the most effective way Mother Nature, in 4 billion years of life on this planet, has figured out for how we can care for each other. Does that make sense? You are participating in an ancient ritual that has been done by every species on this planet for the last 4 billion years, and by every atom and molecule and particle on this planet for 10 billion years before that. Because exchange also happens with subparticles, with atoms, with molecules. That's where we get new chemicals. We don't call it innovation because we think somehow Mother Nature did it 10 billion years ago. But it was innovation. It's the same process. Recombining things by exchange is the fundamental of how innovation happens. All right, I went on a tangent there. I'm sorry about that. I should talk a little bit about what we do. I just want to mention a few keywords here. I highlighted them. Because this can be very academic and intimidating. But usually, I have to put this up at the beginning of a conference because as soon as people hear the word peace, they think it's squishy, it's qualitative, it's not technical, it's certainly not about business, and how could it be scientific? So what we do is quantitative, it's predictive, it's computational. We measure episodes of engagement across different boundaries. And if you are creating a new business, what you are creating is more episodes of engagement across different boundaries. And by doing that, you're creating new wealth. Then you have to look, if you want to be really conscious, you have to look at how it's getting distributed. We'll come back to that. This is fundamentally about de-risking things, and specifically, I should hold the microphone closer, shouldn't I? Sorry about that. Specifically, it's about sending a price signal to global capital markets, because this is where the deep structural problem on the planet is right now. Right now, there is no market signal for the value of peace. And so you can set up a day trading strategy on conflict anywhere in the world, and you can make money. You can set up a long-term investment strategy on conflict anywhere in the world, and you can make money. But if you are a pension fund manager and you have to invest 5 million euros every day somewhere so that your people who are paying for their pensions can afford to retire, you have no way right now to invest in peace. And the problem that then happens is you still have to invest somewhere. That capital has to go somewhere. If you're a banker, all the people who have put money in your bank, you have to pay them interest. That means you have to invest the money somewhere. If there are no good places to put that money because people have been building nonprofits that you can't invest in, there's a really deep problem there. You end up having to make bad decisions about capital that creates horrible perverse incentives. Okay, this is a bit complicated, but take a picture of that and think about it. And this is the simple English. We teach people how to design technology that increases their ability to be good to each other. If you can succeed at augmenting somebody's ability to be good to each other, that will create new value. You can then take part of that new value, distribute it back across both sides of that interaction, and you can take another part and reinvest it in making the next interaction with that person even better. That's where you get to sustainability, and it's that extra new value that you reinvest back in the relationship that makes it not just sustainable, but scalable. All right, can I actually do the, if I do this, I'll remember where I am a little better, so thank you. So that's what we're working on. I want you to see the big picture today, so the rest of this talk is about giving you the big picture about why, if you are working in entrepreneurship or working in business, you are the important person creating peace in the world, not anybody else. Because right now, people don't understand that. And so I'll use the rest of my time just to give you that big picture, and then this afternoon in the panel, hopefully we'll get into a little more depth and detail. What you need to understand is, as a species, we've traditionally taken 4 different approaches to peace. And we look at this, first of all, by looking, here's your life is going just wonderful as you go along in time, and then something happens. Before something interesting, after something happens, you're in trouble, as you'll see here in a minute, because something goes boom, somebody blows something up. When somebody blows something up, we suddenly realize we don't have peace at that point. Traditionally, we have then looked at this in terms of How do we get left of boom? How do we find when boom is going to happen and intervene here on the timeline to prevent it from happening? When we don't succeed at that, we have to do remedial things. This is preventive, this is remedial. As you'll see in a few minutes, what we do in our lab is fundamentally the vaccination approach to peace, not the surgery approach to peace. We don't wait until the doctor says, oh, you have cancer, I have to operate on you. We try and give you vitamins and vaccine long before you ever have cancer so that you don't get cancer. Think of us as the societal doctors that way. You all work in digital. I think a bunch of you answered that. You're the ones of you who are working in business. Even if you're working in a non-technical business, you're using technology to do your business. If you're using technology to do your business, you are parenting the AIs that Dakai was talking about yesterday, and you are, where did Liza go? Lisa, thank you. You are feeding those AIs. Every time you do a transaction that generates data, you're giving them a little spoonful of data for them to learn on. And they're learning about you, but they're also learning a much more important thing about how you're taking care of society around you. So the interesting thing then is online these days, more and more, before somebody goes boom in the physical world, there are all sorts of digital footprints that something's about to blow up. And by the way, most of the things that go boom in the world are not because some bad person decided they're going to do some bad thing. That's not where the big problem is. When you look at all the different ways that humans are violent to each other, that humans kill each other and maim each other and injure each other and harm each other, guess which is by far the biggest? Does anybody know? Guess. Anyone? What, of all the different ways we kill each other and hurt each other, what's the biggest? It's not suicide. No, although that's interesting. I mean physically killing and physically injuring each other, like breaking an arm or a leg or physical injury. So I mean physical violence. What's the biggest source of physical violence on this planet? It's not war, and it's not the workplace, although the work... Nope. Physical violence that is like... No. No. That's a really good guess, though, because intentional, deliberate violence, domestic violence in the home is far bigger than war. It's just spread far thinner, and so we don't see it in the news as much because we see tiny little episodes here and there. But it isn't any of those things. It's traffic. We kill and injure more of each other in cars on our roads by far than any war. And the lesson I want you to take away from that is, it isn't the terrorists or the soldiers or the people who are, or the genocidal dictators that you have to be afraid of. I mean, we should be afraid of them too, but those are a tiny percent of the population who are intentionally doing harm to other people. Most of the big harms in human society are completely unintentional. Very few people get in their cars in the morning and say, I know I'm going to run into somebody and kill somebody today. That really, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people that do that. Most of the harm we do to each other in the world is unintentional, and in every domain you look at. In a business, most of the harm you do in a business is unintentional. In a relationship with the person you love most in the world, most of the harm you do to each other is completely unintentional. You never intended to hurt each other, but it happens. That's where most of the damage occurs, yes.
A terrorist attack, you would kill maybe less people, but then the destruction of the economy would cause, I think mass destruction but not physical mass destruction.
You're right. It's called.
People would get poor and.
Right. So I'm not saying terrorism has no impact.
It hasn't.
I'm just saying, I'm talking about a general principle here, that most of the physical damage we do to each other, and most of the harm we do to each other in any system, isn't caused by intent. It isn't caused by intentional actors. Most of it is caused by accident and by misunderstanding and so forth. I'm not saying that intent doesn't cause harm. I'm just saying ignorance causes far more harm, and lack of intent causes far more harm. So terrorism certainly does cause harm, and oh, by the way, media and mediating technologies are what the terrorism itself hurts a few people, to your point. It's when the media gets involved and amplifies that signal all over the world. They are also distorting a price signal when they do that, by the way. That's the really explosive thing that causes most of the damage. It's a very good point. So in this framework, what I want you to see is, if you can intervene here by tracking these signals, you have a chance to do things preventively. And as an entrepreneur or a business person, what are you trying to get? You're trying to get two things. That's interesting. You're trying to get engagement. It was supposed to say engagement on that slide. And in addition to engagement, the reason you're trying to get engagement is you're trying to get interaction. You're trying to create exchange. You're trying to create those episodes of exchange that create new value. When you are trying to create those episodes of exchange, did that just keep moving ahead in interesting ways? Engagement has three basic behaviors. You've got person A or entity A, you've got person B, and you've got a behavior that person A does to try and take care of person B in some way. We typically think of that as taking care of our customer. Remember what I said, there's always two customers, but it's much bigger than that, as you'll see in a few minutes here. There are some interesting academic things about it that I won't bore you with here, but you should file them away in your mind and dig deeper into them. Take a picture of that maybe. I'm going to skip over this right now. We're focused in our lab on peace as behavior. And there's a reason for that. It's not the only way to think about that. It's not even the best way to think about that necessarily. I'm not going to try and make that case. I'm just going to try and make the case that thinking about peace as behavior, little chunks of behavior that people do to each other, active peace, is the most interesting way to think about peace at this point in history. And it's also the most useful way to think about peace at this time in history, because the kind of technologies we've been talking about for the last couple days can just hoover up behavior data from all over the place. I'm going to skip over this because this is about entrepreneurship and what you're doing in entrepreneurship. And we sort of touched on it already in the extemporaneous conversation earlier while we were getting the slide deck to work. What I want you to see about these four traditional approaches to peace are everything in the world, in society that we have done up to this point was limited by slow processing power, and slow processing power means that punishment is really the only effective thing that works over time. And so our traditional approaches, two of them, have been negative. What you see before things go boom in the space of negative engagement, we have typically taken governance as the approach. We do this with policy and diplomacy. We focus with mechanisms like sanctions and embargoes, or at the individual level, how you interact with your government. It's typically by fines or taxes. Punishment is what works at this stage. It works because historically our computation has been very slow. The human brain is not good at connecting cause and effect over time unless there's a threat there. So this is part of the massive transition that's happening right now. But I want you to go through a framework here very quickly. The hypothesis in this governance space, intimidation gets peace. The cost to society in this space is large. You're funded by your tax dollars. And it requires serious surveillance, which is the kind of parenting that we don't want to do for our AIs. It's really slow. Typically takes a decade or two to change human behavior by law. The main mechanism, punishment, as I mentioned, the number of people employed. This is important. Less than 5% of the population works in government. What that means is the amount of data created in that space is not nearly as big as everybody thinks it is. That means less food for the AI to learn on, as Liza was saying yesterday. And how much of that data is available for you as an entrepreneur to feed your AI as you start to develop conscious and good AIs? Not much in the governance sector. What's the augmenting technology here? It's typically legal code and PeaceTech and courts and so on. Also the prison system. So who are the heroes? That's a big question. Brian has talked several times as he's been training you all about presentations about the power of narrative and the power of stories, and so it's really important to think about who are the heroes. The heroes in government are the presidents and the prime ministers and the politicians. What I want you to take away from here is power is shifting. Power is shifting away from those traditional sources. How do they enforce their power? We move into the other side of negative engagement. After thing goes boom, who normally comes in? It's the guys in green uniforms. They come in and try and fix things. The situation's there. It's violent, it's destructive. It's still engagement, but it's not the kind you want as an entrepreneur. The mechanisms are fairly obvious. They're weapons, they're augmenting technologies for negative engagement. And if we quickly go through these again, you see that also a very small number of the population works in this area. And the data, again, is small, proportionate to the people involved, and very little of it is available to the general public. So the augmenting technology here, nasty stuff. It's still augmenting technology, but it augments our ability to harm each other. And the heroes here, soldiers and generals, and how many soldiers and generals do you know that in the long run have caused peace in the world? What I want to suggest to you here is that as a general approach, you can't beat people until they love you. It pretty much doesn't work in the long run. When we think about the big power shift that is happening right now, this is part of it. Negative engagement is not generative, it's remedial. And this is a big part of what's going on right now. Huge chunks of history, not only of our species, but of every species that has come before us, are determined by whether it's cheaper to organize large groups of that species with rewards or with punishments. And a huge part of the technology shift that is happening right now with the technology you have in your pocket is that this technology makes it cheaper to influence you with rewards than punishment. That is a massive shift in how we have organized our species since the invention of agriculture 22,000 years ago, where I grew up in Papua New Guinea. It wasn't 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. They got that wrong. So we're in the middle of that power shift. It is now cheaper for you as a software developer to give people tiny rewards instantly and condition people's behavior with those tiny instant rewards. That means you can change the behavior of 20 million people in 3 weeks in a way that no president or emperor or pope has ever been able to do in history. And we see examples of that again and again, where a 12-year-old kid in their bedroom over the weekend develops an app that changes the behavior of 20 million people in 3 weeks, and the kid didn't mean to do it. So it's also dangerous stuff. I'll come back to you in a moment if I can. So if we go quickly to what does positive engagement look like, because I want to get to the business part, but I want you to understand the framework and the history and the context in which you're operating. We normally think of the positive engagement sector around peace as being the humanitarian sector. It is positive, but it's coming in after the fact. And oh, by the way, it has tiny amounts of resources. There's a hypothesis here that has been tested again and again and again, and I hope by now everybody realizes this hypothesis doesn't work. Aid does not get peace. Aid is not how you actually take care of each other. Trade, respectful trade, is how you actually take care of each other. So, I won't go into details here, but one final question. How many aid workers do you know? A few? Yes, okay. 3 people in the room raised their hands. I used to be one, and I don't know that many. It's a tiny, tiny segment of the population, and it's tiny amounts of data. We have an institute also in The Hague. In our institute, we sit right next to the UN OCHA, their data science team, as they're trying to gather data in these crisis situations, and they are really struggling to get data there. So this is, to sum it all up here, what I want you to see is Positive preventive engagement is also known as trade. Everything we do in our lab is also in this space, and when you decide you want to be an entrepreneur, you are deciding to act in this space. You are deciding to build positive, sustainable relationships between people and create new capital in the process of doing that, and distribute that capital fairly, and reinvest some of that capital in making that relationship even stronger. That builds the resilient social fabric of society in a way that makes it less likely to tear in future when things go boom. It takes energy out of these systems and puts it here in a way that prevents things going wrong in the future. There's really crucial things going on here, part of which, by the way, is this is scalable. The other ones aren't. They're funded by your tax dollars. This generates new wealth. And this key thing, who are the heroes here? If you're deciding to be an entrepreneur, you're the hero. How many people work in this space? More than 50% of the population. All of the AIs that Dekai was talking about yesterday, they are all created by people working in this space. How much data is available in this space? Massive amounts of data. So if you want to have impact, you have to go where the data is. This is your chance. So please remember this. Conflict and wealth creation have the same raw materials. The raw material is group differences. Group differences, whether they're religious differences or political differences or gender or age or anything else, are one of the key raw materials that create conflict if we don't structure them. But if we structure them into a mutually beneficial trade relationship, it's precisely those same group differences that allow us to serve each other, that allow us to take care of each other. This is Adam Smith. This is fundamental basic economics. It enables specialization, by the way, so that we can get even more different from each other in sustainable ways that can be scaled. And having that diversity is what makes a really healthy ecosystem, which, oh, by the way, makes for the kind of cities that young people want to live in and where you can have more fun. I will end by pointing out that there's a really big structural problem here. Right now, business people are creating massive amounts of peace. They're not aware of it, and they're not getting paid for it. That's a really big problem because of the global capital markets that I mentioned earlier. And I need you to see one thing. When you're building a business, you're not just increasing peace with your customer. You're increasing it with all of these stakeholders because they are all customers of your business. And they are all, by definition, different than you. And you are creating a sustainable, scalable, wealth-producing relationship between all of them. I hope I have transformed your idea of what it is to be an entrepreneur, of what it is to be a business person. And I want to end with one quick story. Last year at the Positive Peace Conference at Stanford, a young PhD student from Aalto University approached me. His name is Tilman Bauer. And we had been making the case, there are a bunch of people out there that are saying, business is bad for peace. And there are other people saying, business is kind of neutral, it really depends on how you use it and how you apply it and so on. And we had been making what we thought was the strong case for business, that business can actually be good for peace. Tilman Bauer came up to me and said, Mark, I really think we've been missing something. I think peace is the purpose of business. And profit is a very nice non-toxic byproduct. And I want to leave you with the thought, I think Tilman Bauer is right. We're changing the approach of our lab based on his insight. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions, or did I use up all my time and then some? Please.
Actually creating peace. So my wife is a researcher who works in the field of the prevention of the proliferation of biological and chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. The way they tackle it at the moment is governance. I'm interested in the idea of how you can use good business, because she works, it's about dual-use technologies. Yeah. They can use be for harm or for good.
In other words, all technology.
all technologies. And it's about intent, as
Yeah.
you were saying. So given your knowledge and your research, what would you propose as a way of creating peace that is alternative to just governance in that area? Is there a way, would you say?
I have a suspicion. Elizabeth, are you here? Is Elizabeth here? From Finland and Greece, who was on stage yesterday. She's not here, I guess. Okay. Talk to her, because she's looking at some interesting things in this space. The main focus of our lab has been increasing positive engagement, which is, our research question is, how good can we be to each other? And how can we use technology to elicit more good behavior? For the people who are trying to say, how do we reduce the bad behavior? We have two main tools in our lab, persuasive technology and behavior design. Neither of those tools really work very well for getting people to stop doing things. And so our basic theory of change in the negative engagement space is, if we create enough incentives for people to do positive engagement, and then the risk is higher and the reward is lower in the negative space, and the risk is lower and the reward is higher in the positive engagement space, hopefully more actors will move from here to here. But that's the extent of anything we're doing in actually trying to reduce negative engagement. So basically, my answer to your question is, our expertise doesn't actually apply very well down here. There are really good people working in that space. CMI in Finland is one of them. USIP in the US, in spite of the current government, is another one. But that's not where we work, and that's not what we do. Yeah. Sorry, I'll follow the microphone around. Who do you?
I need to know, what do you think about maximizing the way the people can trade things and valuing their behaviors, like the gamifications and the cryptocurrencies, rewarding people in different forms. Just, you don't trade by money. For an example, there is a website called Steemit. They are rewarding people about the quality of the posts they are posting. So it's a kind of exchange or making a living. How this kind of activities will exponentially scale this kind of thinking?
It's a super important area. That's one of the reasons we're at this conference talking to you guys. We're very excited about those developments. I don't have enough time to go into a lot of what we're doing there, but we've been tracking the blockchain space since 2010. The guy who was in our lab in 2010 working on blockchain has now had 3 successful blockchain exits, and he's currently the managing director of Neighborly, which has just done urban development bonds in a big way, backed by blockchain again. So we've been following this space. We're active in this space. The missing part, I'll try and summarize with this, the missing part has been a data standard about what constitutes the data that supports that this episode of peaceful engagement between you and I really did happen. You sent me a text. In the process of sending me a text, you bridged the difference boundary between Egypt and Canada, between young men and old men, between Middle Eastern men and Caucasian men, and maybe we have other differences as well. And you bridged all of those differences just by sending me a text, and it's a tiny little episode of positive engagement. And then if we track those sequences over time, we can see all sorts of amazing things. That data enables us to issue peace credits, not only to you for sending the text, but to the company that provided the texting platform. And those peace credits are the equivalent of carbon credits. But we need that underlying data standard across the board. To get people to adopt that data standard, we're using an ICO. So stay tuned.
Very interesting. Right here. Very interesting concept, and it's really challenging. But following the comments you made about the data, my question was, what sort of data are you actually looking in to be able to enforce such premise, such paradigm? I mean, the data set is going to be trying to actually come up with what would define a clean data set to work with is going to be very difficult. So what are you looking at?
So we've created a data standard. I'll just say we've just had a paper published in this space in the Frontiers of Psychology about version 0.1 of the Peace Data Standard. And you can go there and look at that. But essentially, you can apply a data format on top of any mediating technology that is mediating episodes of engagement between any two entities. Whether that's a Yammer channel inside of somebody's company to look at engagement between men and women in their company, which, by the way, Silicon Valley is very bad at right now, or whether that's Fitbit data that tracks how your future happy, healthy self is interacting with your future self that wants to eat more donuts. I mean, we can do internal conflict at that level or at the collective aggregate level as well. Once we have that data standard in place, companies can basically look at their data and go, oh, if we just reformat it like this, it qualifies as peace data. It can be audited by any of the big 4 firms. Credits can be issued against it, and so forth.
We are sorry, the time is not
I think more than
enough
right?
now. So, and
Thank
the
you very
break, you
much.
can ask whatever you want. Okay? Thank you.